Hi, thank you for joining the Housing Action Coalition for our 15th annual Spring Symposium. This is also our second virtual Spring Symposium, second year in a row, and we're all excited to be getting back to face-to-face meetings. And so we certainly are looking forward to seeing you at Housing Heroes in the fall. For those who do not know me, my name is Todd David. I am the Executive Director of the Housing Action Coalition. And for those who are new to the Housing Action Coalition, we are a member-supported nonprofit that educates and advocates for multifamily housing at all levels of affordability that is located in urban centers, near job centers, and near transit centers. Before we begin the program, I want to acknowledge our sponsors for today's event, starting with our presenting sponsor, Facebook. Because of Facebook's sponsorship, everyone is able to attend today's event for free. So I want to thank Facebook for that. We also want to thank our good friends and partners at BizNow for being media sponsors. And then I want to give a special thanks to our platinum sponsors. They include Avalon Bay Communities, David Baker Architects, Google, Related California, Ruben, Junius and Rose, Shepard Mullen, TMG Partners, and the University of California, San Francisco, UCSF. Before we get started on our conversation and our program, we just want to say that everyone, and I'm sure everyone on the webinar will join me in just sharing our deepest sympathies for the tragic events that occurred in San Jose. We are one Bay Area, and we are all hurt by the horrible shooting that took place. Unfortunately, appropriately, Mayor Liccardo will not be able to be joining us today as he is tending to the needs of the San Jose community. And just please join us in really keeping the San Jose community top of thought as we go through our day and the program today. And now to get us started, I'm honored to ask to join on stage our good friend, Assemblymember David Chu, who represents the San Francisco Assembly District 17, the east side of San Francisco. And David, it is always great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Of course, good to see you, Todd, and great to be with the Housing Action Coalition. Obviously, my hope is this is the last time we're doing a virtual Zoom event, but it's good to be with all 169 of you Zooming in from your offices and your homes.
Okay. Well, great. Well, David, just wanted to spend some time with you and talk about what's happening in Sacramento. One of your bills that I would love to get an update on is your AB 215. And so just for those in the audience who aren't familiar with it, you just given a brief overview as to what it is and kind of where it is in the legislative process.
Sure thing. So as you can imagine, as you probably know, there are many, many bills that were introduced this year to address a whole facet of aspects of the continuing housing and homelessness crisis, including our bill AB 215, which is one of the bills in the category of housing production bills. So, with new RHNA requirements, cities are required, as everyone knows, every 8 years to update RHNA and housing elements. But the thing that we have known from past cycles is it's one thing to ask a city to go through that difficult conversation in year one, but oftentimes over the subsequent 7 or 8 year time period, there's very little follow-up. And so we want to make sure that as this hard work gets done, that the follow-up occurs. So AB 215 would do a number of things. It would require cities that are not keeping pace, say by year 4, to engage with the state on a conversation of what more that individual city needs to do to keep on track with their RHNA numbers and their goals. It also says to the worser performing cities that if you are nowhere near close to being where you need to go, the state now, under legislation that was passed recently, has what's known as a pro-housing designation, which essentially means for those cities that are doing a good job, you get some benefits from that, including the ability to get some funding from the state. And what we are saying in AB 215 is if you are one of the worser performing cities, you will then quickly need to make the changes to become to receive a pro-housing designation. And then the third thing it does, folks may remember a couple years ago, I authored a bill along with my colleague Miguel Santiago that gave the Attorney General stronger teeth to be able to bring suits against cities that were flagrantly violating, say, their housing element law. So you may remember the whole conversation around Huntington Beach. So our bill, AB 215, also puts in one of the most important laws that passed in recent years in this area, which is SB 330, into the purview of laws that our Attorney General could use to ensure enforcement of what we need to do to make sure we're producing housing. So I know that was probably in the weeds, but the bottom line is we're trying to figure out every angle we can to ensure that cities are abiding by the laws that we've already laid out and are held accountable not just this year and next year, but for the next 8 years.
Great. And David, can you just give us a quick update as to where the bill is in the
Sure, of course.
legislative process?
So the bill fortunately came out this past week from the Assembly Appropriations Committee, which means that it will be, it is on the floor of the Assembly, and I will be taking it up at some point over the next week. Hopefully we'll get it out of the Assembly over to the Senate for another cycle of fun with the Senate bodies.
Great. Well, thank you for that update. Really appreciate it. Hey, David, I want to kind of look a little bit backwards, but it's really looking forward at the same time. So you sponsored a piece of legislation, I believe it was now 2 years ago, that created the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority, often referred to as BAFA. And I know that there are lots of conversations and talks and hope that that will receive some funding potentially. And so I was just wondering if you could speak to kind of well, first of all, for those who don't know, roughly what is BAFA, why it's important regionally, to the Bay Area, and kind of what the prospects are for potentially getting some funding for it.
So BAFA, as Todd mentioned, the Bay Area Housing Financing Authority, came out of, let's pull out another acronym, came out of the CASA process that you remember some years back were a set of basically a discussion table and a negotiating table over a year plus, where housing leaders from every sector came down and said in the Bay Area, what are important ideas that we could all get behind? And one of them was this idea that we should work together as a region. Seems like a simple idea, but the reality is for decades, we've had 101 cities, 9 counties in the Bay Area that have not worked together. And as a result, you have individual cities, some striving mightily to do more, many not doing much, where we've had this massive collective action problem. And so I was asked out of the CASA process to carry a bill, which I thought was going to be a no-brainer, to say, hey, as a region, let's all work together. And in particular, let's plan for where we're going to build more housing, particularly more affordable housing, and how as a region we could consider financing this together in the way that we have financed, say, Bay restoration work and transportation measures. So I introduced this bill, and I remember the Chronicle, the first day I introduced the bill, said the following: David Chu has stepped into a political typhoon. Never had that said about a bill that I introduced. But for the better part of a year, we had a pretty intense discussion about whether the region wanted to work together. And fortunately, at the end of that year, the region said yes. We worked with both MTC and ABAG to come up with a governance structure for a housing financing authority that basically lives within the MTC, but is governed by the shared structures of ABAG, which to be blunt, is more heavily represented by suburban communities in the Bay, and then the MTC, which is viewed by some of those suburban communities as being more dominated by urban voices. So we have essentially a House and a Senate that are governing how we think about regional affordable housing development. At the moment, we are having a discussion in the legislature about whether we can use some of this year's housing surplus to fund some of the early activities of Baffa. Our hope in the coming years, when life goes back to normal, is we can consider a Bay Area ballot measure akin to Bay Area transit measures that could allow us to support as a region the idea that we need to build more affordable housing that will hopefully not just build that housing, but also mean that the expense to all those cities around affordable housing and market rate development will be somewhat reduced. So that's where things are. Stay tuned. We'll certainly be in touch on that as more things develop.
Great, thanks for that update. Hey, David, so one thing that we like to ask at the Housing Action Coalition to all of our speakers, they will be getting the same question. What are you optimistic about when it comes to housing? You go like, when you look at the landscape, what is the thing that you're like, yeah, I am optimistic about this?
So I'm optimistic about the fact that today in 2021, compared to when I first went to Sacramento 7 years ago, everybody understands that there is a crisis. There's a consensus that there's a housing crisis, there's a homelessness crisis, there have been renters, eviction crises. It is at the top of the agenda. I was shared with a poll recently, just this past month, where it said that literally 98% of the California public believes that homelessness is a serious issue that we have to tackle. I've never seen numbers like this. So that's a good thing. There's consensus on the problem. The challenge, as we all know, is coming up with consensus on the solutions. And I would suggest, I think we're moving in that direction on a lot of different fronts. But it's going to take a lot more work. And I really just want to thank the Housing Action Coalition, Todd, and you and your team. You have really helped to educate the public on what the challenges are and have worked to provide kind of sophisticated policy solutions that have been part of the policy discussion in Sacramento, and really appreciate that. Now, clearly, we still have a lot of work to do. There is not consensus on all fronts of what we need to do to tackle homelessness, to protect tenants, but particularly to build more housing, because fundamentally all of these crises stem from the fact that we have just not produced enough housing. And fundamentally, that's the hardest set of questions we have. But you guys really have been at the heart of this, and appreciate your work with us. I know Senator Wiener, Assemblymember Ting, your San Francisco delegation, we see the impact of your work every day.
David, just, thank you for your leadership on this issue and your partnership with the organization. Really appreciate it. And thank you for taking time out of your day to kick off our spring symposium. Always great to talk with you.
Absolutely. Look forward to seeing everyone soon in San Francisco and the Bay, and have a great morning.
All right, take care. All right, so now I would like to invite Michael Matthews and Michael Covarrubias to join me on the virtual stage. Michael Covarrubias is the CEO and chairman of TMG Partners, and Michael Matthews is the Facebook's state policy director. They are going to have a conversation about what we are doing to try to address missing middle income housing. Michael and Michael, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Todd. And thank you, Housing Action Coalition. Brother Michael, I think our part may be even shorter, since David Chu was doing such a terrific job, and can answer. I'd love to hear him talk even more so, but I think our task is to go forward on the missing middle. Why don't we dive right in there? If you don't mind taking on the first bite of this.
Sure.
What is the missing middle, and why is it important?
How come I got the promo thing behind me? You got out of it. That's all I want to know. So, I tried to think about it in two ways. There's the mathematical answer to what the missing middle means, and as everybody on this audience knows, there's every level from very, very low income to very low income, and there's 30% of median, 50 and 80, which I categorize in the affordable housing realm. The next part, from 80 to 150, typically in an urban area like San Francisco or Oakland or Los Angeles, is what we define as the middle income. And then above that is market and the villain of all conversations, luxury housing. In a metaphorical way, I was thinking it's kind of like having three kids. You know, you have your first, which is the one who gets all the attention. Typically, they go on to be the most aggressive and achievement oriented. And I think of that as the affordable housing group. It's the one that gets a lot of attention, a lot of money, a lot of effort, rightly so. Jumping to the third child, it's kind of the free-spirited one. It's the one that kind of hasn't been burdened down with all the rules. And that's kind of market rate. It either happens or it doesn't, and it kind of comes and goes. The middle one is the one that gets the most stress. It is the one that it doesn't get the attention, and it's our firefighters, it's our first responders, it's our teachers, it's the carpenter who can't live near the jobs. And so I think it's a little bit of it's somewhere in the 80 to 120 range mathematically, but it's kind of the missing middle is also the middle child.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, we see it too from our perspective of the lack of impact or growth with supporting the missing middle is impacting the first responders and teachers and others who are living so far away from the work or having to do extreme housing situations that are it's just not healthy and sustainable for where we're at. Secondly, while what do you think is some of the steady progress, if any, in terms of addressing this?
Yeah, I wasn't told in advance I'd have to give a statement about what I'm optimistic about. So I'll leave that up to
that
David.
Comes later.
Yeah, David did a good job on that. I do think that, when he mentioned the word CASA, which I got a chance to co-chair, our original motto and mantra was housing for all. We recognized there was homelessness all the way up to market rate housing and everything in between. And that if we tried to just do one or the other, we would fail because they are all interconnected. In many ways, that market rate housing supports the income needed to be able to do the affordable housing. So the legislature, no surprise to anybody listening, is very difficult. David mentioned, gee, we all agree there's a crisis. We just can't agree how to solve it. And that's not untypical of the housing issues we've have battled the last few years. My optimism, however, I think is sort of focused on one area we succeeded in, and it started with the Bay Area Council and then moved on, and it's the ADU project. There were no ADUs to speak of in California 5 years ago. And even though the production of housing has continued to go down and down and down, both in market rate, both in, single family, as well as multifamily, ADUs have gone crazy good. They are all over the state. They are not only the recreation of a garage, they are a separate unit being built. And I think those, to me, are an indication that the demand has been there. We just didn't know how to feed it. It was too hard to feed. And so the optimism is that people will look to expand the housing base if we give them a chance.
That's a good point. Let's talk about the crisis part of this. I agree with David, and the numbers are right that this is housing for all across the board, is polls at the very high level. I do wonder though, while there's awareness that there is a crisis, are we the greater we acting like there's a crisis? And I'm sure, for example, in all facets, certainly the governor has been stepped up big and addressing housing in a number of areas, certainly, the urgency and homelessness, but as well as and working that, as well as the three mayors or two of the three mayors who are participating following us, but all three certainly for quite some time have been stalwarts. And we're on the CASA steering committee, as you were fully well. But it worries me to some extent. You can look, frankly, even the crisis, the pandemic, about how this nation responded unevenly, at the very least. Reminds me of maybe we have a bigger problem about how we address crises in a timely way. Whether it's we all agree it's a crisis, but in locales may not act that way.
Yeah, it is a difficult conversation because it starts with the premise of a lot of folks who believe in a zero-sum game. They believe if I give to that, I lose. And that mentality leads to stalemate. It was the initial premise of the CASA, then became 3Ps. Again, Mayor Schaaf, who's coming on next, and Mayor Breed and Mayor Liccardo were all with you on the steering committee. We had to go into that saying you have to give something to get something. And now that that activity is less, we're not really CASA per se. People fall back to their silos, and that's the reason why crises just remain agreed upon. There's a crisis, but how to solve it is, not in my backyard.
Yeah,
everybody knows. So that's the dilemma that David Chu and Scott Wiener have. Today, I just was notified that Nancy Skinner, I think it's her bill, SB 9, just made it through the Senate. That sounds like a Herculean effort. Now it has to get through the assembly. Not the same, but that was an effort to try to increase the number of houses that could be built on a single family lot from 1 to 2.
Yeah,
earth shattering, right? but we all know that the folks who believe that is the end of life as we know it will come out and fight that. That's just not right. And then they'll go on to say, and why is the state telling any city what to do? And you go through that battle. So I think David alluded to that with the ABAG comment. So
right, exactly.
It's tough to get everybody marching the same way. The leaders of the assembly and the Senate and the mayors have to, gird their loins and keep battling and get one little victory at a time, I think.
Now, as you said, 101 municipalities in 9 counties.
Yeah.
How do you do that? One of the things about
just Northern California.
Yeah, exactly. Forget about statewide.
Yeah.
No question. I mean, one of the things about the crises that I've thought about in terms of housing is it's a crisis, we agree, but is it a crisis for me if I have a home? Do I feel the same way about a crisis as, say, if you don't have one? It's a crisis if you don't, for you. It's important to me, but is it really a crisis in a day-to-day existential sense? And that, I think, is hard to.
Yeah. Well, the old joke is a NIMBY is someone who house closed yesterday, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And, exactly.
And it's human nature to want to protect your fort. That's why they built moats in the old days. They protect the castle. But math is math. The state is growing. We have a labor force that's left us. They couldn't afford to live here. They've moved away. You look at the restaurants who are trying to reopen in the cities. Look at the jobs that are starting to get funded so they can go hire carpenters to build some units. Everybody has the same problem. The workforce is left, quote unquote. And the reason they've left is not only they couldn't afford to buy a house or a unit, they couldn't afford to rent a house or a unit. So it is a crisis of multi-legs, and it is just chipping away at one minor solution after another. A lot of what the groups in Sacramento work on is trying to increase density bonuses for doing certain things.
Yeah.
A density bonus doesn't take anything away. It just gives you more capacity. But again, a lot of people act as if it's a zero-sum game.
Yeah. Well, you hit on, I mean, at the risk of parading Facebook in any fashion, but you hit on one of the reasons why that we're actively, and other, Apple, Google, others, and Genentech, the rest, are actively involved in housing, because we recognize that it's the right thing to do, but it's also common sense or good business about how you recruit and retain talent in an environment where if people can't afford to live and grow their families close to where they work, and that's just not, and which is one of the reasons why we talked about our investment in $1 billion is on housing has been teacher housing, or partnership with the Bay's Future, or even ELI, low income investments in manufacturing innovations, and also public partnerships with the state and others to find for that missing middle. And we're all looking for those solutions there.
Yep. And looking at lower cost ways to manufacture.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's, where we live, where we work is we're part of those communities. This is our community, and it's important for us to address that issue.
Yeah, I think we all know there's not a solution. We're all clear on that.
Yeah,
and so it takes a little bit of construction costs, it takes a little bit of land costs, it takes a little bit of financing costs, it takes a little bit of less cost to get it entitled. And it takes a little creativity on where to put the density so that we don't have more smog and issues from transit. That was the original reason that a lot of the legislation was passed.
That's an excellent point, and I actually had a conversation with a colleague just yesterday about this. I guess goes back to the sort of the Hearts and Minds campaign and the crisis response is really underscoring that there's housing, but this is also an environmental importance.
Yes, absolutely.
And health, and as a consequence, our health.
Yeah, makes me crazy. So
Yeah. Mental health. Sure.
It has all of those elements. I mean, and we'll read about the results of the pandemic in the next couple of years that are not the obvious ones. There'll be the results of the stress, the results of the commuting, the housing, that will come back, and the fact that they're still too hard to get a job. And so it'll be a challenge. And as I said, I'm optimistic that David and Scott and Nancy and Buffy and all those people up in Sacramento have this on their radar. They are relentless advocates of getting something done. They just have a lot of uphill battles.
Yeah, no question. That's why I think everyone on this call participating in this forum is committed to helping in any way we can, certainly. That's where the optimism is for me as well, is there are moments, whether it's innovation ideas and things that may do more localized in the communities, the involvement of not just electeds, but other community and business trying to find ways to come together in this. And quite frankly, there's no other option but to be optimistic. Pessimism, we're in it right now. So what's the point of being pessimistic?
Not to pat your arm back, but you guys and the other giants from Google on have really stepped up. I mean, you don't expect that sometimes, but you hope for it.
Sure.
And you guys did it. It is. I think I got a little bit of a quip once upon a time with Mayor Schaaf, I believe, stating that $1 billion isn't going to solve anything, but it wasn't meant to be a criticism. But it takes a village, and it takes all the companies to be doing what they're doing. It takes all the politicians. It takes the development community to help. I always say we don't have a dog in the hunt. We don't do as much housing as we do office, but nevertheless, without housing, there is no office.
That's right.
And so we do it because it's the right thing to do, as you were saying. But you have to be persistent and dogged in dealing with the battles that will come, and it's based on siloism, if there's such a word.
Yeah, and we all have to give something too. I mean, there's of our of our own self-interest a little bit too. I guess that's the point about a crisis. When you truly recognize you're in a crisis, you move quicker and you give up some things, recognizing that there is a greater good or greater gain down the road.
It's a theory we tried to put forth, and when we got our 10 elements of the compact, everybody did it, and then we got into Sacramento and Southern California and Northern California. And as we say, the sausage is not fun when you watch it being made, but
not at all.
We got some stuff done, so we're proud of that. And as you pointed out, you and Mayor Schaaf and Mayor Breed all played a huge role on that. So,
and everybody else at the table, it was a diverse table.
It was.
And that's what was the best part. And I think they're right. That was we were on one side of the wall. We didn't have to do the technical work. That was where the sausage was.
That's right.
But I commend those who really did that, because everybody gave.
Amen. And we had to do it in public hearings, for God's sake.
There you go.
I think it was a good effort.
Good. I think we're at time. I think we did this actually on time. So I think we'll turn it back to
all right.
Todd. Hopefully we didn't go too long.
No, that was great. You guys want to go another 5 minutes? I mean, like, if you're, both of you, thank you so much for joining us today for the conversation. Really
A pleasure.
appreciate it. And of course, we appreciate both Facebook and TMG's support of not just the Housing Action Coalition, but your real engagement in trying to solve the Bay Area and the state's affordability and displacement crisis. Both of you, I know, both of you individually, I know, roll up your sleeves and do a bunch of work on that. So thank you for that.
You bet.
Appreciate
Well, I'm
that.
looking forward to listening to the mayors and
Absolutely.
the real good stuff.
All right. Well, sounds good. Well, with that, I am going to invite Mayors Schaaf and Breed to join me on the virtual stage. Hey, mayors. Hello, Mayor Breed and Mayor Schaaf. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it. You know, when we walked into the office, when staff walked into the office this morning, you know, we were, you know, excited and anxious about the spring symposium. And we were also incredibly saddened by the news in San Jose, you know, and we were talking amongst staff about how it's, you know, not that it was predictable, but how it's just becoming, you know, common in the United States that these shootings. And so, you know, I just, before we start our housing conversation, which of course I want to have, I just want to, you know, offer both of you an opportunity if there's anything, you know, that you want to say about the shootings in San Jose, just give you an opportunity, a minute or two to do that. Mayor Schaaf.
No, just deep prayers for the whole community. This just horrific kind of violence is so unacceptable. And I think it, one, we all have to send, you know, our thoughts to Sam Liccardo. Both Mayor Breed and I know what it's like to hold grief and anger and just the horror of an incident like that. So just lots of love to Mayor Liccardo as he holds his community in this moment of grief and helps heal and chart a path forward. And it's also a reminder, I think, to all of us as we come out of this pandemic, the need to address mental health in our cities is more poignant than ever. So let us all redouble our commitment to that. Mayor Breed?
Yeah, and I appreciate your comments, Mayor Schaaf, because you and I both struggle, you know, of course, with, you know, the gun violence that has plagued our city for so many generations and the frustration that comes because of the challenges and the grief. And when you really look at what happens around mental health and how our mental health system, not just in this state, but in this country is completely broken, where it's very difficult to get people the help that they need so that some of these challenges don't occur in the first place. It's been a difficult, frustrating task that I've tried to move forward in, and my heart truly goes out to Mayor Liccardo and the people of San Jose, and the people who lost their lives, their families, and what they're going through right now. I know it's just a tragedy of this nature is really horrible, and we feel for our colleague in San Jose so much because of what roles mayors play in trying to make sure that things like this never happen in our cities. And so we're here for him, and we wish he was here, and we understand why he can't be. But our hearts and prayers are with the people of San Jose at this time. So thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you both for those thoughts. So pivoting to housing, and so, you know, I like to say that we have an embarrassment of riches when it comes to pro-housing executives at our major cities in the Bay Area. The two of you and Mayor Liccardo have all been phenomenal leaders on the housing front. And so, you know, one of the things that is really exciting for the Housing Action Coalition for advocates is we are seeing kind of this wave of zoning reform kind of, you know, move through Northern California, certainly Sacramento, in Berkeley is really, kind of leading the way. And what I am curious is that if each of you could talk about what is happening in Oakland and San Francisco, specifically, is there a movement to reform, historically exclusionary zoning in your city? And so I was going to start with you, Mayor Schaaf.
Well, I've always been a very clear advocate for getting rid of single family zoning. It is exclusionary. It's deeply rooted in racist practices that have maybe at this point been unwittingly perpetuated. But the exposure of that connection is something that should horrify everyone. I directed staff to start the work to start moving our zoning. We all were hoping that the state of California would make it a lot easier for all of us with things like SB 50, but we all saw those attempts get stymied, which was extremely frustrating. So we are having to do the work, which is so much harder and more labor intensive at the city level because we have to go through CEQA. But we are doing that work nonetheless. We are committed to it. I'm very encouraged that the City Council in Oakland passed a unanimous resolution supporting that work. It will be incorporated into the update of our housing element. It is going on right now, and we expect that it will be finished and adopted at the end of 2022.
And Mayor Breed.
Yeah, and I'll just say that it's been a tough conversation to have with people because on the one hand, people want cities to be more affordable and want more people who struggle with access to housing to be housed. And on the other hand, there's the challenge of zoning in particular neighborhoods where people don't want to change neighborhood character, right? And so I remember, and I keep going back to this conversation because I do think this puts it into perspective. When I was running for mayor, at the time, SB 50 was SB 827, and Scott Wiener introduced that bill as well. And I was the only candidate for mayor who actually supported it. And so many people around me said, well, wait a minute, the West Side folks, they're going to be angry. They're not going to support this. This is crazy. What are you doing? And when I remember being at a debate where, most of the people there had lived in San Francisco for well over 40, 50 years or born and raised or what have you. And so I proposed the question, how many of you were born and raised here or lived here for over 50 years? Almost all the hands went up. How many of you raised your children here? Almost all the hands went up. How many of your kids still live here? Hardly any of the hands went up. And I think I like to put it in, rather than getting so technical about the number of units and neighborhood character and everything else, it's like, why your kids and my friends and my generation of San Franciscans can't afford to live in San Francisco is because once we got ours, we didn't want anyone else to have theirs. We didn't want to provide access to housing for other people as a growing city. People are not even able to afford to raise their kids in a place like San Francisco because we've underbuilt housing. And it's really not fair. And it's going to get even worse if we don't start picking up the pace on building housing now. And so when we talk about even something as simple as 4 units on a corner block or 4 stories in an area that is like, wait a minute, that's too much. It's not too much. Things are changing, times are changing. Access to housing needs to change to meet the increase in a population. And if we want things to change and we want to deal with homelessness, affordability, equity, and all the things we claim as progressive cities that we care about, we cannot continue to be obstructionists when it comes to building housing.
Amen. Yeah, that was great. Thank you, Mayor. Mayor Reed, I'd like to dig into a little bit to your agenda for housing. You've, as I've said at the beginning, you have been a phenomenal pro-housing mayor. You've had a very pro-housing agenda. And as we are well aware, that perhaps your partners at the Board of Supervisors do not share your enthusiasm for that agenda. And so I'm just curious, as you think about executing on your agenda, what strategies are you thinking about given kind of that dynamic of the different vision, perhaps at the Board of Supervisors?
I thought that was your job to deal with that strategy stuff, Todd.
I do the best I can.
Yeah, look, I can't, what I really try not to do is make a lot of excuses. And as you know, just recently before this pandemic, I decided to go around the Board of Supervisors. They could easily help put a charter amendment on the ballot that would allow for, the layers of bureaucracy to be gone for people who are building housing within the existing zoning, not asking for a height increase, not asking for anything other than what is on the books in terms of the law, so that people who are obstructionists and holding up really important housing can't continue to do that. And so this was a ballot measure that, I had considered, that I was basically collecting signatures for. I had the resources to do that, and pandemic hit. So my plan is continue to, whenever possible, take these initiatives to the voters. It's not the way that I want to do it, but I can't sit around and wait for a new crop of Board of Supervisors members or, the political climate. I'm not going to do this job in fear of losing it. And so my goal is to continue to leverage my resources, to get things on the ballot, to communicate to voters as much as I can, so that they can hopefully advocate for these types of things with their members of the board. But sadly, as you and I know, over the years, it has not worked. And so just communicating in a way that people understand, like exactly what I told you in terms of that example, like that really, and to be clear, I won the west side of town when I ran for mayor, because at the end of the day, people understand, okay, well, that makes sense. We can maybe work from that point. It may not be everything I want, or I may oppose something, but at least let's have the dialogue. Let's have the conversation about what we can do. And let's not make the proposal so complicated that all people see is, oh my God, you're going to build high rises on the west side, or oh my God, this is going to mean, problems for my community. It's like, how do you communicate the message? How do we get other people on board? It's not about telling people what they should do. It's about bringing people along in the process of what you're trying to accomplish. And so my plan is to continue to talk to the people of San Francisco, to bring ballot measures if necessary to their attention, and to move aggressively in trying to get this done. And let me just say lastly, I was in the Diamond Heights community last week, where it's going to be 12, I think it's 8 new units or 12 new units, something like that. Anyway, all affordable units, all home ownership, Habitat for Humanity. The city typically usually doesn't provide resources for a project like this, but we got very creative. The community rallied around supporting this project. It's really amazing. And so the work that went in on the front end made this possibility happen. It was a donation of land for someone who really wanted others to have home ownership opportunities. And so I think that it's important that we don't just give up and stand down, that we try to be inclusive and include communities in the process of trying to get the job done, because we are hurting in the Bay Area for new production of housing in general, and we got to move faster, and we got to look at the ballot whenever we fall short at the council or the Board of Supervisors.
Yeah, that project, that Habitat for Humanity project in Diamond Heights was really exciting. I live just next door to Diamond Heights, in just Noe Valley. And, I think that the opportunity, we need to be increasing opportunities for first-time home ownership, right? And that building that generational wealth. And so that was just it was great to see that project move forward. So thank you, Mayor Breed, for your and your team's support for that. Mayor Sheff, I want to switch a little bit to more of a regionalism conversation. And specifically, I don't know if you heard earlier, I was talking to Assemblymember Chu about Baffa. And I know that you are intimately involved, and I believe you have a fancy title over there. I think you're the Finance Oversight Committee, the head of the Finance Oversight Committee. Anyway, I wanted to know kind of first of all, what are your hopes for Baffa, and what are the plans? What do you see happening, and how it can help, address our affordable housing needs throughout the Bay Area?
Yeah, no, thanks, Todd. Baffa is an exciting new tool. It stands for Bay Area Housing Finance Authority. And yes, I am the first chair of the oversight committee of Baffa, because Baffa essentially is MTC. MTC members are Baffa, is the Baffa authority. And the MTC committee, oversight committee, meets jointly with the ABAG Housing Committee. So we're really trying to start integrating the ABAG work and the MTC work. You know, when David Chu and Assemblymember Chu helped us create this regional financing authority for housing, it was very exciting. And of course, everyone kind of felt like the first order of business was going to be putting a regional bond measure in front of our voters to see if our 9-county Bay Area, 101 cities, could, as a region, approve bonds for more affordable housing. COVID happened. The decision to not go forward with that election, with that campaign in 2020 was the right decision to make at the time. And so, you know, Baffa kind of retooled, what can we do before we have a significant amount of resources to work with? And so the initial business plan is put forward 5 pilot programs that we believe will really build the architecture so that Baffa is ready when new funding sources become available. And let me just go through them really quickly because it's important that everyone knows about them and also advocates for the seed funding for these 5 pilots that we have put forward as a priority budget ask from the state government for the whole Bay Area. The first is Doorway. It would be a regional online platform to connect residents to opportunities for affordable housing across the region. We all know that it's very sad. Many of us are still giving out pieces of paper to people and sending them to various different affordable housing developers or specific projects to put in their application to get in the lottery for that great golden ticket of an affordable unit in the Bay Area. But oh my gosh, what if people just went one place and could then choose what projects or profiles that interested them? A huge support for not only our affordable housing developers, but really for our residents that need this affordable housing. The second pilot is the Pipeline Project. It would be a regional database to track the production and preservation. I love that second P of affordable homes. The third would be an affordable housing preservation strategy. Michael Covarrubias was being very funny, talking about missing middle housing as the second child who often gets ignored. Well, I think the second P is kind of the second child. There's so much expertise around production. There's a lot of expertise and advocacy around protecting tenants, but not as much expertise on the preservation strategy, and particularly smaller jurisdictions that don't have the housing resources like the big cities have could really need some technical support in how to preserve affordable housing and convert naturally occurring affordable housing to actually regulated, protected affordable housing. So very excited about that. The fourth pilot is a rental assistance network to help us make better use of the extraordinary rental assistance resources that are coming from the state and federal government. And then the last of the 5 proposed pilots is the homelessness prevention system. This is in coordination with All Home, really looking at building on things like Keep Oakland Housed, a partnership that is helping prevent homelessness before it happens, but at a regional level. So that's what I'm excited about. We're hoping the state is going to fund. It's about an $18 million ask, very, very small, all things considered, as we build momentum towards a ballot measure for the whole region.
Great. Thank you so much, Mayor Schaaf. So as Michael Covarrubias kind of announced to everyone, Senator Atkins' SB 9 made it out of the Senate, which is very exciting. Yeah, it's great. And, you know, I was, one of the things I was thinking about is, once again, like the Bay Area, Oakland and San Francisco specifically, really have an embarrassment of riches as far as pro-housing legislators in Sacramento that both of you have outstanding working relationships with, right? You know, Mayor Breed, I know you have, you know, your partnership with Senator Wiener and Assembly Members Chu and Ting are, strong on the housing front. And Mayor Schaaf, I know that Senator Skinner and Assemblymember Wicks and now Attorney General Bonta, and we'll see who's, will be the Assembly member, that those relationships are strong and that you all are really aligned on housing. There is this constant conversation in California as to what is the appropriate role of the state and, with on housing. And I was wondering if both of you would be willing to kind of talk about how you see what is like a great, in your minds, what is a great partnership between the state and local municipalities when it comes to housing. And so I was gonna start with you, Mayor Schaaf, if that's okay.
There's this interesting dynamic between flexibility versus local control. Local control is killing us. It's kind of a shorthand for NIMBYism. And I'm fresh from my MTC meeting where, we barely got an endorsement to prohibit parking minimums within blocks of transit centers. A pretty basic climate action, pro-housing policy. And the vote was 10-5. 5 MTC commissioners voted no on supporting this legislation, which really is a wrap of flexibility, because let's not build parking spaces that are not needed. It wastes money. It takes resources away from building the housing. The market will determine how many parking spaces are needed. Cities do not need to artificially inflate that requirement through regulation. That's the kind of fights that we're still having. At the same time, I know Mayor Breed and I and Ricardo have been part of, for the first time, getting homelessness resources straight to cities. And we've demonstrated that we're actually able to move more quickly with more impact than some of the traditional manners like through the county government. So we like some flexibility. We like a direct investment in cities because we have the capacity to actually move quickly and with impact. And sometimes we're willing to take a little more risk than some other layers of government. So this partnership has been great. I think we are very blessed to have very innovative and powerful representatives in Sacramento. I, for one, really appreciate the partnership.
Well, I think that with the density bonus in particular, that's been really very helpful with providing increased density, increased number of units for our various, not just regular housing projects, but our especially affordable housing projects. And it provides, in one case, there was 160 units, and because of the state density bonus program, there's another, I think, 10 or 12 units that are going to be added to this particular project. And so I think having that state support where, honestly, unfortunately, people who are NIMBYs for the most part saying, well, you can't go higher than this and you can't do this and you're blocking my view. Well, having density bonus and having the state regulations in place where it prevents obstruction of building housing is important. I think there's a place for state regulations. I also think that part of the challenge is there's not a one size fits all with cities. So it's important to think about that. And it's also important to hold all the cities accountable for their fair share of affordable housing in general, because we have places in the Bay Area that have increased job opportunities, but have not done one thing, haven't lifted a finger to build any new housing developments, which puts places like San Francisco and Oakland and San Jose at a real disadvantage and a challenge. And so I think there has to be a level of accountability for all cities in the state to do their fair share. I do think there also needs to be a way to prevent, when you have city councils and board of supervisors that are not necessarily moving an agenda that allows for more housing, this is a better tool to go around all of that.
Hey, it's Scott.
Yeah.
Can I add? Home Key, I think, was a great success. The governor put out this challenge, let's like permanently house people by converting existing buildings. I mean, this was monumental. We, in 3 months, created 184 units, new units of affordable, deeply affordable housing in Oakland for our formerly homeless residents. I mean, that one of our providers said this literally is something that took us 6 years to do the last time we actually created a facility like this. And we were really pissed off that the high cost cities, the 3 of our cities, did not do well in the CIDLAC process. But then when you saw the May revised, the governor kind of recognized that and said, all right, let's fund the unfunded projects that didn't fare well in CIDLAC. So that kind of relationship, I hope people see is positive, and it really is making an impact on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, Mayor Breed was talking a little bit about some of the bad actors in the kind of Bay Area. And I know that there was, or if I'm remembering correctly, right, that there was a fairly strong response from the 3 mayors about the RHNA allocations. And so I was just wondering if, do you, or either of you kind of want to just kind of talk about what your impression was on the RHNA allocations and maybe what frustrated you or what you liked about that. Libby, do you have any opinions on that? Excuse me, Mayor Schaaf, I apologize. I slipped, my bad, sorry.
It's okay, Todd. We're on a first name basis for sure. So, I'm really excited that the RHNA numbers are going way up. Like, we're ready to meet that challenge. In the past, we haven't had to rezone just because we're already prepped for more housing. This time, we're going to have to do the analysis and look at that. But again, know that we're in the process of doing that as part of our single family, getting rid of exclusionary zoning practices in general. But the other cities, the cities that have not been pro-growth, that have been a lot more reluctant, this is another place where I see Baffa as a huge benefit for the Bay Area region, because it's going to provide centralized technical assistance for the smaller cities that have been reluctant or don't have the bandwidth, don't have the internal capacity to actually start adjusting and meeting these higher RHNA requirements. So I'm excited that we're pushing people to actually do their fair share with housing, but we're also providing them some help in getting there.
Great.
Yeah, and I would just say that I'm a little torn on this. On the one hand, I do think it's important that other counties are doing their part, because they haven't been. And the other side of it is, in San Francisco in particular, it's very expensive. And it's very challenging. So more changes, more legislative changes to our policies that make it easier for us to produce housing in the first place. Reforms to CEQA are going to be critical to helping us get to that place. So I just think it's one thing to make a requirement and to put a requirement out there, but we in addition to dollars, we need changes to policies in order to make the housing that is required of us a reality, because we have set a goal to do at least 5,000 units a year. We have been struggling with even meeting a goal of that nature. So it's just not realistic without some significant changes to policies that we're going to meet this goal moving forward. But we're grateful that others are going to be required to do so as well.
Thank you. So as you may have heard earlier, we like to finish all of our conversations on positive notes, and we want to know, what are you optimistic about on the housing front? And so I'm going to start with you, Mayor Breed.
Well, what I'm optimistic about is that, for the most part, people want to see change. And so they're open to it. When we did polling on the as of right legislation that we were going to bring to the ballot, people were enthusiastic about an opportunity like this. And so I think that if we bring the proposals to the people, they will be responsive because of the challenges that exist around access to housing, affordable housing. But when I say affordable housing, not just housing that has affordability covenants and a requirement in that, right? But just the ability to afford with a basic middle income access to purchase a home or to afford to pay rent without being burdened by the housing costs. So I think ultimately people are ready for change. They will be supportive of change. I wish that our legislative body was a little bit more cooperative in efforts to produce that level of change, because it could make a world of difference. I'm also optimistic about the future because regionally we're working together. We're looking at ways to make sure that all cities are doing their part, their fair share in housing production in various cities throughout the region. I think that's going to mean for a great opportunity. So I think that working together, the huge financial investments that are coming from the state and federal government, the ability to manage the resources that we have directly and allocate them to projects to get people housed sooner rather than later, the breakdown of the bureaucracy and all of those things combined will help lead to a better future. Things don't have to be so complicated. And my strongest desire, what I'm most optimistic about, is just my push to get rid of layers of bureaucracy to get the work done. So I'm going to continue to move in that direction. And there are fierce advocates that we have, and mayors like Libby Schaaf and Sam Liccardo. And I'm looking forward to seeing some real change over the next couple of years as it relates to housing production in the Bay Area.
Here, here. I'm all for a less irritating government. And I think, we've had a rude awakening this last year about how we need to be a platform that enables what our residents want rather than is constantly regulating. Todd, I'll tell you, there are three things that make me optimistic and excited. One is the YIMBY movement. I just love it. Enough said. Two is the welcoming of modernization and efficiencies in construction. Oakland is getting ready to advance a big set of code changes to make modular, alternative housing types like tiny homes. Like, we're getting ready to kind of revolutionize what is allowed and how we facilitate these advancements and innovations in our city. That excites me. And then the last thing that truly excites me is having partners in the White House. The Biden-Harris administration gets that housing is infrastructure. And we have an opportunity like one that we have not seen for a long time to really advance that as a permanent fixture in our mindsets around infrastructure at the federal level. I'm excited about the idea of housing choice vouchers as an entitlement. These are monumental changes, and to have leadership at the federal level where it can have the type of scale and impact that we can't have at the local level, that is exciting me tremendously. And for those of you who aren't already involved, and I thank Mayors Breed and Liccardo, who are founding members, it's a group called Mayors and CEOs for U.S. Housing Investment, is a bipartisan group of mayors with business leaders that are really advancing this idea of housing as infrastructure. So incredible opportunities right now in DC. And that's not something I would have said last year.
And one of the things that I want to add just to close it out, and I appreciate Mayor Schaaf's comments so much, and it's great working with her as a partner. I want to be clear, because the other thing I mentioned and forgot to mention is around the messaging. I don't want people to think that we are going to do what the old redevelopment agency did, and that is tear down sound housing and destroy communities in order to build high rises. So I want to be clear that when we talk about messaging and what we're talking about is zoning, our goal is not to, do redevelopment 2.0. Our goal is just to look at opportunities when they present themselves, and to also protect people in their existing homes by any means necessary as we begin to grow in our community. So it's so important. And I think that as we develop this messaging in a way that is fair and meets the needs of communities, it could really make a big difference.
Well, thank you both, Mayors Breed and Schaaf. As always, it is always a pleasure to get to speak with both of you. In the Housing Action Coalition, we look forward continuing to partner with you to further, the agendas that pro-housing agenda that we all share. And again, I just want to thank both of you for your leadership. I mean, it is just really, from an advocacy organization's point of view, it is just really tremendous to have such great leaders at the head of, all three of our major cities in the Bay Area. And so we continue to keep working. And Mayor Sheff, thank you for teasing our conversation with Housing and Urban Development of Richard Cho, where we will be discussing housing as infrastructure. So perhaps you'll stick around and listen to that conversation. Again, thanks, and have a great rest of your day. Really appreciate it.
Thank
Thank you, Todd, for everything you do.
Our pleasure. Now I would like to ask HAC board member and Initialized Capital partner, Mai Cutler, to join us. Hi, Mai. Thank you so much for joining us. Staff is very, very excited about this conversation. So Mai is going to be moderating an amazing conversation with three of the great housing reporters in the States. And so we welcome Jerusalem Dempsis from Vox, Liam Dillon from the Los Angeles Times, and Molly Solomon from KQED. So Mai, take it away.
Sure. So I'd love to kind of do a stage setting question here. I think, Liam, you and I have been kind of thinking about these issues for the better part of a decade, or probably longer, actually, in your case, like based on your work when you were working for the Voice of San Diego. And I'm just curious, like, what's different and what's the same about, when you started reporting on housing in California to, what the situation is today. And then after that, we'll, dive into more of the specifics of this last year with everyone.
Sure. So I think it's probably hedging it being better and worse, right? I mean, I think I'll start with the worst because I think that's what people sort of see and feel, right? I mean, by basically any metric over the past 5 years, homelessness is up in California, housing is less affordable in California, and there are fewer, further behind in the housing shortage and all these sorts of things where it's very obvious that by kind of any metric, whether home buying metric or renting metric or homeless metric, things are worse than they were, right? And I think we should keep that in mind because of all these kind of airy discussions that we tend to have about policy and the politics of it. For folks on the ground, things are worse in just about every single way. And with that downer, I'll reflect on the way that things are better. Is that there is a lot more attention being paid and a lot more thought given to the kinds of solutions and kinds of ideas that I think may go a long way ultimately if they're ever realized at alleviating some of the problems that we're seeing. But I think at the local level, the state level, and at the federal level. And so a lot more attention, a lot more thought, a lot more nuance, I think, in some of the conversations and policy discussions. But the fact of the matter is things are just way worse than what they were 5 years ago.
Can you give me a couple specifics on what's different, good, than when you started?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of, so I'll just give a good example. When I began reporting, I'm currently based in Los Angeles, but I spent about 3 years in the state capitol reporting for the LA Times out of our state capitol bureau. And when I first arrived in 2016, the prevailing conversation and the dominant conversation at the state capitol as it related to housing issues was sort of bringing back some form of redevelopment or some form of local dollars and dollars that would go towards housing, low-income housing specifically. And that was basically, with some exceptions, like the predominant only conversation that was really going on at the state level on housing policy. Housing was seen as this local, almost entirely local concern. Right. And I think that, what we have certainly seen is a variety of different kinds of ideas when it comes to zoning, when it comes to financing, when it comes to a lot of different things where the conversation is much more broader. And again, also, as these sort of years have gone by, much more nuanced about specific ideas and ways to address some thorny issues that get into when you talk about zoning changes and how they may affect different kinds of communities and things of that nature. And so I think the conversation, again, is a lot more a lot further advanced and a lot deeper and a lot broader than what was happening, particularly at the state level 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Molly, you've done some really great, shoe leather on the ground reporting over the last year in the midst of this pandemic. And I'd love to hear at a high level, what have you seen on the ground from both tenants and homeowners through the course of this health crisis and recession?
Yeah, I mean, similar, like best of times, worst of times, for sure. It's almost like we're living in like two different housing realities when I'm talking to, folks that already own a home, and then when I'm talking to renters. When I've only been reporting on housing for about, I guess, like I started right before the pandemic, so this is kind of all I know. But it's been, I mean, it's almost like all of the issues that have been there and that have been simmering under the surface in terms of like the unaffordability of living in the Bay Area, like COVID and the pandemic, it just turned the heat up on all of that. Like I've been speaking to a lot of folks that have, been evicted, that have not been able to pay rent because they've lost their jobs during the pandemic. And they're really on the end of things that, are seeing the worst of everything that this pandemic has had to offer. Their jobs have not come back. A couple folks that we've been following throughout the course of this have fallen into homelessness and are now, renting rooms out of motels because they can't find affordable housing because all of the lists are years long and they can't even get on the waiting list at this point. So, I think that if you've been able to stay housed at this point, am I breaking up? I don't know. My internet is a bit unstable.
Yeah, I'm like, there's an eviction moratorium, there's a rent relief program. Like, what are those working? What's working about them? What's not working about them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what's come out of this is pretty big stuff in terms of like, there are a network of protections. There's the statewide eviction moratorium. There's a lot of local programs that go even further that prevent folks from being evicted if they're able to prove that they lost income during the pandemic. And, if you look at the rates of eviction and the number of, notices that have been filed, unlawful detainers that have been carried out, like a lot of that is just so much lower because of those protections. So I think that you can see that those policies, they are working, but they can't last forever. And they're not going to last forever. There's an expiration there. And I think, especially when we look at how the rent relief program is working or isn't working right now, there's a lot of challenges. There's a lot of bureaucracy to, you have a big idea, let's get $2.6 billion in rent relief, which is huge, out to folks who really need it. But I think what we're seeing now is that, it's really slow and there's a lot of layers and there's, people that are having hard time accessing, even applying for some of this relief. So, while there have been these big things that have come out to help people that are really struggling right now, some of it has been difficult, in terms of actual implementation.
What are some of the specific stories that have stuck with you most as a journalist over the past year?
It's probably the biggest thing that we did on the housing desk in the last year was basically a podcast that looked at solutions, possible ways forward. And that was something that I think we really thought about during the pandemic because it felt like, so many people had suddenly felt even more connected to housing in their home. And we're seeing all of the connections that it had in your life, in terms of all of the different ways that housing can really determine your future. So I think it was important to think that coming out of the pandemic and looking ahead, we had to really think about housing in a different way. Whether that was, examining zoning policies, looking at if there was an opportunity to think of housing as a form of reparations for communities that have long been discriminated and, segregated in housing. So, I mean, I think just following that line, it's kind of been interesting to see, not that we're on the other side of this pandemic, but just to see how these seeds of ideas that we talked about in the podcast are actually really, really growing in different ways. Like, we started out looking at Room Key, which was, a pretty fast way to get people that were living on the streets in their cars, into homes, into these hotel rooms across the state. It's now sort of evolved into this Home Key, which is really going to be to permanently create housing, like in a matter of months versus in a matter of years, which, just seems like light years ahead of what I'm used to when I'm thinking about affordable housing projects. So I think just seeing, the evolution of that over the last year has just been really interesting as a housing reporter. I'm curious to see what the sustainability of some of these programs are going to be like. We're at such an urgent emergency state of mind, especially when it comes to housing folks. I don't know what happens to that urgency when, you know, the pandemic is over, and what the long-term sustainability of home key could be like, when we don't have that pressure of, you know, needing to house people during a global, you know, health emergency.
Jules, and congratulations on becoming a permanent Vox reporter this week. I'm curious what this looks like from a national level. I mean, you did a story this week on this fascinating thread that the CEO of Redfin did about, like, you know, the emergence of remote work and like what's happening to housing markets across the whole of the country, which is honestly super bizarre, as Molly was sort of alluding to. Like, what are you seeing from the national level?
Yeah, so I mean, first things first, excited to be here. Thanks for having me, Housing Action Coalition. And I've been following Liam and Molly, your work for a long time, so cool to be here with you. From a national perspective, I think it's super interesting because a lot of these fights have been had in coastal cities for a long time. So there are these established kind of political buckets that exist, but in most of the country, kind of homeownership and like housing and renting are just considered like, yeah, it would be good for more people to be homeowners and we want rents to be low. And there's not really a lot of existing massive political fights around it. Obviously, that's something that will change as these kind of housing prices kind of start rising precipitously, and people have to make decisions around how they want to or don't want to change their local regulations. But I do think there's a lot of, cause for optimism here. You look at places like Connecticut, where there is some modest reforms being suggested at the local level, things like ADU reform and even some hope around transit-oriented development. And then you look at North Carolina, which has a bill moving through its legislature. So if you look at it, kind of to take a step back from a lot of the places where these stories are often centered, you do see areas where legislators are taking steps forward to address these problems before they become massive catastrophes like they have in a lot of our coastal cities. I think also, especially if you're looking at things from a federal level, this is kind of the first year you've seen so much action, both on in terms of providing aid. I mean, just a massive amount of aid has been provided to renters, both in terms of specific numbers, like $45 billion or $46.5 billion or something in rental aid that's been dispersed by both by Congress in two buckets. Then you have, of course, the eviction moratorium, which was just absolutely unprecedented. And then the rest of the federal aid that came about, whether it's in extended unemployment insurance payments and stimulus payments, economic impact payments, all of those things culminated in, most renters were able to make payments. The data is between like 80 to like 93% of renters are at least only one are current on their rent, or maybe have missed one rent payment, but that's something that's not a huge catastrophe. That doesn't mean that, all those people are fine, of course. A lot of folks who I've talked to are people who had to take loans out from their family or friends, or had to really cut back, or, make other kind of economic sacrifices. But it does speak to the fact that, the federal government has been engaging in a way that's, really unprecedented. And at least now the Biden administration and the new Congress have been putting forward several different proposals, which I think are very interesting to kind of address the larger housing shortage problem. And this is not something that the federal government has really taken an interest in outside of, a little bit of action at the end of the Obama administration. But I think that really signals that there's a big win coming.
Given that there's a federal panel after this one, I mean, what are you looking for what specific policies are you looking for that you think are, promised to be the most enduring and impactful? And then what do you look at that's more like what we saw at the end of the Obama administration, which is like a nice carrot, but did it really do anything? Like, did it really actually do anything? Yeah.
So most of the federal plans are carrots, but I do think that they do provide some level of incentive for change at the local level. Of course, not the most intransigent suburban communities, but plans like Amy Klobuchar's plan, which would provide grants to local planning departments to help them actually implement zoning reform. There are, and I've talked to a few of these in kind of suburban Minneapolis, where they have been affected, especially by the racial justice arguments being made in the wake of the last year, and do have some kind of understanding that they have, some obligation to change their existing zoning framework, but they don't have a master planner in their office. They have someone who spends day in, day out responding to incoming zoning requests or questions from businesses or residents or things like that. So those folks, even if they wanted to, couldn't really upzone or make some massive planning change without some sort of help. So there are communities like that where you do see the effect of these grants could actually be pretty big. I think also, of course, the Biden administration has proposed providing just a $5 billion pot for any community that chooses to remove some of its existing onerous regulations, and it would provide them kind of it's just like prize money essentially. There's mixed belief on how much this would help. I mean, there was hope that there would be more, there would be tying funds to existing pots of money, things like community development block grants or surface transportation block grants, which are really essential to a lot of communities. And there was hope that would be tied to those to changes in zoning codes, but it doesn't look like stuff like that's going to happen. I think that it's hard to contextualize this, how big of a deal even the small reforms are being made at federal level, because I think it goes beyond just the actual policy changes and goes towards the signal that's being sent from the federal level that for decades, or actually almost over 100 years now, this has been considered an issue that is supposed to be dealt with at the local level entirely. And the fact that the federal government is signaling that, hey, there are massive economic ramifications for what is being done at the local level, particularly in these major cities like LA, San Francisco, Seattle, DC, Boston, et cetera. I think that is a major tonal shift. And if you have someone like President Joe Biden in his meetings with the Democratic Governors Association or with the conference of mayors and things like that, addressing these issues, it becomes more salient to folks for whom this was just kind of a background issue. And I think that has a lot of impact as well.
Liam, for you, I mean, when you look at some of these potential policies coming out of the Biden administration, and then also obviously out of the state of California, like what in your, opinion, experience, like in terms of carrots and sticks actually works with a lot of these communities in terms of, reforms?
Yeah, that's a really good question. First of all, if that's Molly's actual bookshelf, I'm like over the moon impressed at that. That's incredible. So that's been distracting me, and I feel like I had to say something about how amazing that is. But
it's all a lie. This is my my tiny desk concert.
But to your point, Kim, I think there is an interesting. Let me try to answer it a different way. I think, particularly in California, I discovered reporting on this that there actually has been this long set of rules that have been around, in many ways since the late 1960s when it comes to, housing plans required under what's technically known as the housing element of using regional housing needs assessment, and all these laws, the Housing Accountability Act that have come out of that. We're going on 40 years now, 60 years in some cases where these laws have been on the books, right? And it's just that there's not been a tremendous amount of attention paid to them, at least in recent years, and also, not a lot of enforcement of those rules. The first major story I did on housing issues at the LA Times was about how this housing element zoning goals process was a waste, because everyone knew it was a joke, and it was this planning exercise that every 8 years every city would have to do, and there were so many ways for cities to figure out, who didn't want to comply, to figure out the way out of it, that it didn't really matter, right? And there have been a lot of new laws that have passed since, also a lot of more advocacy around this from a lot of different kinds of organizations and energy that speak to potentially putting teeth, not only putting teeth, but actual enforcement in some of the laws that were on the books. And so I think more so than, or as much as rather, a particular set of policies and new policies and new carrots and sticks, taking a look at what has been on the books and actually working to enforce them, or thinking about different ways to enforce them, is just as, has been just as meaningful. And I think you are seeing a lot more energy and advocacy around those sorts of things at kind of with very different kinds of groups, whether it's, nonprofit affordable housing organizations, certainly some YIMBY organizations as well, tenant advocacy groups, kind of all engaging around a lot of this existing infrastructure that was there and just was never a priority.
also, I'd love to get your, I mean, okay, the Newsom administration, like he campaigned and promising like 3.5 million more homes or whatever. Like how has he done? Like, I mean, overall, I mean, not just in the supply, but on housing policy in general, how would you assess his administration so far?
Look, I mean, if you compare to what he has said he was going to do to what he's actually done, there's no question that he didn't do it. It failed, period. I mean, period, right? And to me, I've said this many times. I mean, I think like it's not fair to hold him to account necessarily to the exact number you have to produce X number of units, because he doesn't control the price of lumber, which is up 80 gajillion% over the past 6 months or whatever, right? So that's not his concern. But I do think it is fair to hold him accountable to, if you're going to put a number out there of this unprecedented level of housing production, quintupling what the state's been doing, every year annually, then you have to put out a plan that would be commensurate with actually doing that, whether that's radically changing zoning rules, radically changing environmental rules, spending tens of billions of dollars more a year than what we've been spending on affordable housing, right? Just something that matches that, and he hasn't done that. Now, I will say, I think there are some notable changes and successes that he can probably point to. The state did put into place a cap on annual rent increases that was not here, before he came into office. And while not as aggressive as I think many tenant advocates is hoped, statewide, it's among the most aggressive in the country. And then secondarily, I think the Project Homekey effort, which Molly alluded to earlier, regarding using, during the pandemic, using depressed hotel values and spending a lot of public money to buy them up and convert them to permanent homeless housing, with a much lower cost and in a much quicker way than otherwise we would be able to do. Thousands of units have been produced that way, and that it was, I think, a really good example of you doing something innovative and smart and quick to be able to make some headway in an area that traditionally was and still does take a long time. And so I think certainly there have been some successes, but compared to what he's promised, not even close. Not even close.
Mm-hmm. Jerusalem, you've spent a lot of time thinking about and writing about messaging, political messaging, what works, what doesn't. How is your thinking evolving on how to communicate the urgency of these issues and how to communicate like effective solutions for change to voters?
Yeah, kind of like two things on that is, firstly, the reason why this matters is, as Liam mentioned, there are a lot of these rules that exist on the books, but there's just so much leeway at the local level for people to kind of futz around that you can really end up complying with rules in many cases, but still not actually producing more housing. I think a key example of that are places where you've seen ADUs get legalized, but then localities will say, well, you have to have 4 parking spaces per ADU, and so no ADU gets built. So things like that, it's very easy to see how any kind of required change from the top level without having some kind of buy-in at the local level could really make it difficult to actually see material changes happening in terms of housing production. So a lot of existing research around this, has focused on just kind of why is there this big gap between what people say in the abstract is good, like people are like, yeah, of course we should build more housing, of course there should be more affordable housing, of course there should be support for homeless individuals, and what actually happens when proposals are brought in their neighborhoods. Of course, this is where the "not in my backyard" kind of moniker comes from. So I think that there's existing polling. Vox, we did some polling with Data for Progress that kind of looked into this question, and that was replicated by Yale researchers at Josh Kalla and Michael English. And basically what they found is that there's obviously some harm being done when, or at least there's a reduction in popularity when people focus on the racial justice angle versus the economic benefits angle. My interpretation of this is that obviously these kinds of national polls are going to be really hard to suss out what's going to happen in each individual place. There are obviously places that are much more progressive than others. And
what kinds of language does that, what does that mean in terms of actual language or framing?
Sure. So of course we've seen, discussion about how there is residential segregation that is promoted when you have these strenuous zoning laws, its language around saying that it's a racial justice issue, saying that segregation is the premier reason why we should be tearing these things down. And of course, talking about the completely true history that these zoning regulations were often created in response to Black people moving into new neighborhoods. So I think that the predominant thing here, though, is that when you turn on this kind of zero-sum thinking when it comes to housing, you are going to get a lot of backlash. The reality is that there's much more popular messages, and I think this is something that the Biden administration and federal governments are very attuned to, which is why you don't see as ambitious proposals being brought out right now, is because they are really worried about what kind of backlash this would cause, especially as a lot of messaging around this in Democratic circles has focused on this racial equity lens. Now, again, it's very hard to say what that means for each individual actor, how they should behave in terms of trying to increase housing production. I think that people should just know their own communities at some level, but also it's that there is clearly a problem with framing these kinds of arguments around zero-sum thinking. When people have invested probably the most money they ever will invest into a single asset, which is their house, telling them that they should be altruistic with that asset is just not going to be, it's not going to be, convincing or reasonable to them. There is tons of research showing that upzoning can actually increase property values, tons of research showing what it can do for rents, and also how it can be in the best interest of homeowners. But the final thing here is just like there has to be some recognition of the fact that there needs to be some reconsideration over at which level these kinds of decisions should be made, because there's a lot of research as well. Of course, Catherine Einstein at Boston University has done this research showing that the types of people who are actually opposed to new homes being built in their neighborhoods are disproportionately homeowners, they're disproportionately men, and they're disproportionately voters, and they don't reflect the actual community, and that renters in an area are actually often actually in favor of these projects, but they just aren't at these public meetings to talk about it. So the answer to that is not force a bunch of low-wage workers to show up at public meetings at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. The answer has to be there needs to be a better way to aggregate the preferences of people in these communities and implement them into policies. And there are various ways that can be done. Of course, in California, there have been various proposals to move this to a higher level beyond just kind of the local zoning authority. And also there's a bunch of research around not making this a project-by-project discussion, but just like, every region needs to provide some level of housing production, and if they don't, the state needs to step in some way. But I think that those are the major points that I think are most interesting for policymakers right now.
So if I'm talking to a concerned hypothetical neighbor,
Sure.
What language should I be using?
Well, I think that it really depends on who your neighbor is. If you know that in general, I think that the thing that you need to make clear is that it is in their best interests for more housing to be built in their area. If there's someone who's really is communicating to you that I'm really concerned that my property values are going to go down, talk to them about the existing research that shows that property values can go up in neighborhoods where upzoning happens. Talk to them also about the other unseen economic benefits. Talk to them about how the fact that their kids could potentially live in their neighborhood, or they would have the ability to build a mother-in-law suite who could help them take care of kids if they are choosing to have them in the future. There are a lot of unseen economic costs that people don't think about, especially when you think about congestion, when you don't have these walkable neighborhoods that are more dense. You have to get into your car to go places, and that costs, of course, a ton to individuals. And making it that kind of personal ideas of like ways in which this is impacting them, I think is the most valuable thing. When you abstract away, and it's not just racial justice arguments, the St. Anselm University, which is a university in New Hampshire, did a poll that showed even when you abstract away to like these broader economic arguments about how it's affected GDP and like the average wages of a worker, those kinds of things are not very compelling to people. And so I think the important thing is when you're talking to your neighbor, like know who your neighbor is. If you know that they wish that their kids could live near them, talk about that, but make it very personal to what their experience is and how more housing production can affect them.
Yeah, I'd like to have a general question. Anybody can jump on. I'm curious about how the movement of people during and after the pandemic, is it going to permanently alter politics or voting behavior in the state or in other metro regions? Yes or no? If so, how much? I know that Liam.
Yeah. I mean, I'll start. I've done a little bit of reporting on this. Went to San Francisco and talked to folks who actually moved in to San Francisco from Oakland to save money on rent, which was sort of that idea, rent being cheaper in San Francisco than Oakland, kind of mind blowing. Also went to Fresno, which has seen by one metric, the highest rent increases in the country on a percentage basis over the last 4 years, which is also kind of nuts as well. I mean, people now paying, $2,200 for a 1-bedroom in Fresno, which is, rivals some, yeah, thanks Kim for that, rivals rivals like LA Beach City rents, and so, I mean, and I think we saw this with sort of the recent stuff that came out about California's population changes, losing a congressional seat because the population is not growing here as fast as other places. And then secondarily, actually losing population for the first time in sort of recorded history, right, modern California history in 2020, I think really highlighting for people. And if you look just to dig a little bit deeper into, who's leaving and who's staying, contrary to this popular belief that, California is taxing rich people out of the state, rich people are moving in and poor middle-class people are moving out. And the reason why is because it's too expensive to live here, right? And I think the pandemic is only exacerbating those trends. There's nothing that seems to have happened in the past year, particularly in the economic situation where white-collar workers have been fine or good or even better than they were prior to the pandemic. And, blue-collar, poor folks have been way, way worse than what they were before the pandemic. And so that divide in the economy is only going to exacerbate these income inequality issues that we've had in the state, driven by housing affordability predominantly, that I think is going to continue to get these demographic shifts that, change how politics works, where, you have a continued pressure, I think, from higher and higher income folks who can't afford to live here, and even worse, out-migration among the folks who are already kind of on the knife's edge about this.
Mm-hmm. Molly, one thing that we've seen, the actual migration data pre-pandemic doesn't necessarily support this, as Liam pointed out, but I don't TBD on the, post-pandemic data, but, white collar workers are more likely to be able to work from home. But the flip side of that is the lowest income workers in our economy really can't work remotely and can't move and have the greatest need for housing that is close to where they work. What do you think needs to change about policies and programs in the state based on, some of the behavioral stories that you've seen in the last year?
I think it's similar to what, Liam was just talking about too. I mean, the affordability thing is just getting worse. It's like it was already expensive to live here before. And I mean, we're in the hottest housing market we've ever had, so it's like if you don't have a home and the security of being able to buy a home, it's even harder for you to become a first-time home buyer, or if you have bad credit. It's just so competitive right now. And I think when we talk about rents, softening, at least in San Francisco or, other expensive metro areas, they didn't really soften on the low end, for when it was multifamily apartment buildings that were already on the, lower rent scale, like those actually got more expensive and more competitive because more people were trying to get those places who maybe lost a job or got a hit to their income. In terms of things that need to change to make California a place that people move to make it more affordable. We got to build more housing. We got to build more housing for people who can afford it too. I mean, it is a huge production problem. We have been underbuilding for a long, long time. We've got to make it cheaper to build housing so that we're not spending, $1 million a unit to build housing in Los Angeles for affordable housing. So, I don't see, a task force or recommendations or some sort of, blue ribbon group that's going to solve the problem being the answer. Like, I do think that if anything, I hope that this pandemic is going to force people to actually push through solutions and not just have them die in Sacramento. But yeah, I think it's got to happen. We've got to make some sort of movement on this because we didn't have the affordable housing available. It was already too expensive before, and I do worry that it's gotten significantly worse.
I'm not sure if any of you can speak to the production labor and materials side, but obviously we've seen both labor shortages and then a huge spike in the cost of lumber. What can be done, or what can be done on a policy perspective in Sacramento that could really address both the labor and materials issues?
Well, just speaking from the lumber side of things, I mean, I think there are a lot of uncontrolled factors there. I mean, one of the factors is that climate change has led to like a specific type of beetle eating up a bunch of the usable lumber in like Canada. Like, not really much you can do about that. And then of course but I think the second side is that of course there was the building industry was not expecting this much demand, which just goes to show how pessimistic people are about our housing production post 2008 kind of Great Recession era. Like, you just didn't have them expecting this much, increased demand. And of course, they shouldn't have. But with low interest rates, you saw this massive incursion in the market of millennials and first-time home buyers. That is something the government could do, is basically making firm commitments to increasing housing production so that the industry can plan. They're not going to make capital investments to ensure that they can meet high levels of demand if they aren't going to be given some kind of firm commitment that the government's not going to undercut them at the local level every time a developer wants to put in affordable housing unit in a rich area. So there are a lot of things they can do to make clear signals in the economy that housing production is a priority, and it's going to be pushed through regardless of, at some level, regardless of what's happening at the local level politics. So I think that's something that's really important.
One of the legacies of the last Great Recession was that a lot of mid-career talent in the construction and trades left California and left us, unable to meet subsequent demand from the following decade. I'm curious, Liam, if you have any sense of like what the fallout from the construction side might be from this particular recession or pandemic-induced recession.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I have a tremendous amount of expertise on this, so I'll just try to kind of answer shortly with what I recall from. I mean, as you said, there was already concern among trades workers that the supply of labor was not there, and when I would ask, developers, if why don't you just pay construction workers more, and then that question wasn't always received very well. But I do think that was a bit glib, and a bit more than just like pay people more, right? I mean, I think that's probably part of the equation, certainly. But I think, as you alluded to earlier, like the pipeline for construction workers was really sort of irreparably damaged, it seemed, after the Great Recession 2008, and for whatever reason, policymakers have not figured out a way, or developers and labor themselves not figured out a way to rebuild that pipeline, whether that's on account of significantly lower immigration or things of that nature. It's just not there. And so I have not seen, frankly, as perhaps because it's not as sexy as some of these other issues, a lot of thought and sort of in-depth policy proposals coming out of Sacramento that would really go a long way towards repairing that pipeline, other than, we should throw in this historic surplus that we have, throw some few $1 million at apprenticeship programs and, rebuilding, those sorts of things. So.
Cool. Well, thank you all three of you so much. I'm going to turn it back to Todd, and he's going to shepherd in the next session.
Thank you so much, Kimai and Jerusalem, Liam, and Molly. As you all were talking and we were nodding in agreement, I was checking bylaws to see if we're allowed to offer board member seats to members of the press. That was phenomenal. It was also great to hear Liam's Philadelphia accent. Made me feel like I was home again. So that was awesome. Anyway, Richard Cho, could you please join me on the virtual stage? Hello, Richard. Thank you so much for taking time out of, helping run the country to come speak with us at the Housing Action Coalition. Really appreciate it. We opened the program saying that, like, how excited we are to bring the federal perspective to the conversation. As the previous 4 years, there has not been a lot of excitement in the housing advocacy world about the federal role in this. So we're really excited to have you. I would love to start the conversation by just kind of talking a little about infrastructure. As you know, we're all aware the Biden administration has a really ambitious and exciting infrastructure plan, and part of that is housing, is infrastructure. And so I was wondering if you could just kind of talk a little bit to that for those of us who are not familiar with that concept.
Yes. First of all, thank you, Todd, so much for having me here. Just by way of introduction, my job is to advise HUD Secretary Fudge on all things related to the intersection of housing and services. Todd, I thank you for your question. The President Biden has made it clear we need to invest in our nation's infrastructure, and that's part of his vision for Building Back Better. We're very happy that of the $2 trillion or so that the president has been asking Congress to pass through the American Jobs Plan, one of the things that we want to see investments in is housing. So within the American Jobs Plan, there's proposals for a $213 billion investment in affordable housing. And one might ask the question, and certainly we've been asked the question, why is housing infrastructure? Isn't infrastructure roads and bridges? Well, we think, you can't really build an economy back without housing. You all on the West Coast certainly see that, right? When you have had significant economic growth without investments in housing, you have a situation where you have a severe housing shortage and housing crisis. In other parts of the country, where they haven't had a shortage of housing per se, or where their challenge is that they can't actually grow their economy because they don't have enough housing for their workers to invest in. So you go to places like Kansas or North Dakota, you have business owners that are struggling to be able to grow their economies locally, or even hire and attract more employers because you don't have enough housing. And so we see housing as vital to infrastructure. It's the places we live. If you think about roads and bridges, what do they actually connect? It's places where we live to places where we work. And so you can't think about investing in our infrastructure without also investing in housing. And we're proud to say that the investments that the president's calling for in the American Jobs Plan are not only investments in housing also for people who are in the lower income ends of the spectrum as well.
Great. And Richard, let me start by apologizing. I actually did not introduce you. So let me go back and introduce you. So Richard Cho is the Senior Advisor for Housing and Services for the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So thank you again for joining us. Sorry that I forgot to start the conversation with introducing you. Moving on to the next question, certainly one of the things we were talking with Mayor Schaaf and Mayor Breed about this, right? One of the things that we as advocates are really excited about is that we are seeing a wave of rezoning really through Northern California, with some of the major cities in the Bay Area really leading the way of eliminating historically exclusionary zoning. And we're just kind of curious, do you believe that there is a federal role, an appropriate federal role in this movement, and in saying that where zoning has more always kind of historically been thought of as more local type of issue?
Yeah, we certainly do. I mean, and Secretary Fudge is very aware and concerned and committed to addressing the fact that we have local zoning that has inhibited the ability for us to build more housing and affordable housing in particular. The impacts that has on racial segregation, which continues to make our country not only more segregated, but also have significant divides in outcomes. And so people of color, low-income people are constrained because of the fact that they have limited housing options, and a lot of that is because of local zoning codes. We believe the federal government does have an appropriate role to play in that. At the same time, we recognize that zoning decisions are local. And so what we think as the appropriate role for the federal government is where we can help really spur the conversation at the local level, give communities the tools, the incentives, and also the resources to be able to convene those conversations locally, to really examine both ways that their zoning has contributed to racial segregation, has contributed to the inability to scale up the development of housing and affordable housing in particular, and really has contributed to a housing crisis that impacts all of us. I think in the Bay Area, what the homelessness crisis looks like. You see how visible it is. Everything we know about why homelessness is rising in particular places, it's because of a shortage of affordable and low-income housing. It's not like you can ignore and communities can turn a blind eye to the fact that they need more affordable housing. I think all communities need to do their part to be able to increase affordable housing. So Todd, I think we absolutely see this as something that the federal government can take action on, but we want to do it in ways that we're actually allowing communities to engage in that conversation locally, but we can engage in a partnership to inform that conversation.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So you did you did mention homelessness. One of the things that really we at the Housing Action Coalition think about and talk about quite frequently is the pandemic, and that how it really brought to light these long existing inequalities in the housing market, right? And so, I think when we first heard, we often will talk about when we first heard the term shelter in place, like, what does that mean for someone who does not have shelter? And, we think about that, or we will often say that these problems pre-exist in the pandemic, but the pandemic really just kind of brought them to the forefront to really, shined a light on those issues. So I'm curious, what is HUD's vision or view, or what's the plan to try to help address these inequities and specifically, right, the homelessness issue in the Bay Area and actually what we're seeing nationally?
Yeah, Todd, thank you for that question. What Secretary Fudge has said, and what we've all been confronted with, is the fact that, and I think you said it well, Todd, like last year when COVID-19 arrived in our country, all of the public health orders were stay safe by staying home. And yet you had over 500,000 people in this country on the day when COVID arrived in this country who literally had no home to stay safe in, right? And so, and you had people who were forced to stay in crowded concrete shelters, or frankly, to live on the streets where they had limited access to hygiene and other amenities. At the same time, when soup kitchens, drop-in centers, although in libraries, places where people who are unsheltered have to go. And so, in many ways, people experiencing homelessness, and I would also say people who live in congregated institutional settings, really bore the worst of the pandemic. Most of us, like we suffered with social isolation, we suffered from food shortages, we suffered from just the inability to live life in a normal way. But imagine, at least most of us had some stable place to at least be safe and home and stay home. And yet, again, 580,000 people or more had no ability to do so. So what this administration's done is, in the American Rescue Plan, is we made a clear statement that we need to address housing needs across the board, but in particular, focus on the people who've suffered the worst of the pandemic, and that's people experiencing homelessness. So the American Rescue Plan includes $5 billion in homeless grants for communities to build more affordable and supportive housing for people experiencing homelessness, as well as 70,000 emergency housing vouchers that we just recently awarded. I'm pleased to say we recently received the responses back from the housing authorities that received their allocation of those 70,000 vouchers. About 97% of those were accepted. A vast majority of housing authorities not only said, we'll take the full allocation that we've been given, but if there's any more, we'll take more. Some housing authorities asked for hundreds more, some thousands more. And so what we're seeing is a huge recognition across the country that we cannot have a situation where people have to suffer from a public health crisis in a way where they're worried about their health every day. And so this administration is committed to, at least, if not solving homelessness through these resources, making a significant dent with the vouchers that we have, as well as the resources to build more units.
Great, thank you. And Richard, we like to end our conversations with all of our guests by asking, what are you optimistic about on the housing front?
I and some of you know, I worked in the Obama administration at the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness previously, and at that time we were trying to solve issues and solve homelessness, but without any resources. So I remember we were under sequestration of the federal budget. There was, we were not only told no new resources, but also 5% cuts across the board. The only place where we saw investments was for veteran homelessness, and that's a place where we saw a 50% decline in veteran homelessness because of the investment of resources and the commitment on the part of the federal government and communities to drive down that number. Well, now I think we have an opportunity to make a significant dent in homelessness for all populations, because we have an administration that continue to fight for resources. We know you can't solve resources without, you can't solve homelessness without new resources, but resources alone don't take it, don't solve it. You need strong implementation on the part of the federal government, and you need the leadership at the local level. And so you mentioned Mayor Breed and Mayor Schaaf. We're excited to be able to partner with local leaders such as Mayor Breed and Mayor Schaaf and many others to really create a federal and local partnership. I'm committed to and convinced that we will make a significant dent in homelessness, as well as prevent millions of renters from housing loss, as well as millions of homeowners from facing foreclosures because of the action that this administration has taken. So Todd, I'm optimistic on a lot of fronts, because you have a president and you have an administration that recognizes that we have to build America back better from this crisis, address the immediate crises, but also strengthen our country so that next time we have, whether it's climate-related disasters or public health-related disasters, you don't have a huge segment of our population that is vulnerable to those crises in ways that are really unimaginable.
Well, Richard, I really want to thank you. You know, we feel very fortunate in the Bay Area that we've had such great local leaders on these issues, like Mayors Schaaf, Breed, and Liccardo. And at the state level, we've had phenomenal, electeds who are really been rolling up their sleeves to address it. And it's so nice for us to add that we now have a federal leadership on this issue. And so we are just excited, and we are optimistic that we are going to be able to get housing built for at all levels of affordability with this, amazing partnership between the federal, state, and local. So, just want to, again, thank you so much for taking the time to come speak with us today to add that federal perspective. And I just want to also take this time to thank everyone for joining the Housing Action Coalition for our 15th annual Spring Symposium. We had a great time talking about growing momentum for more equitable, affordable, and inclusive housing across our region and state and country. And again, a special thank you to our presenting sponsor, Facebook, and to everyone who tuned on Zoom today. Have a great afternoon, and we really, really, really look forward to seeing everyone in person at our Housing Heroes in the fall. All right, take care. Bye.